If it seemed like war yesterday, the reinforcements showed up tonight. At the center of it all, of course, is the bombed-out shell of the federal office building.
We are just 10 days away from the Oklahoma City bombing anniversary. 168 innocent people lost their lives nearly 16 years ago. Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols were convicted, but there has always been a question about a possible third suspect.
Do you think the FBI covered up the real story of the Oklahoma City bomb?
Yes.
A man looking like this. Rick says the sketch stemmed from this body shop in Kansas, where Timothy McVeigh rented the now infamous Ryder truck. Rick says at the time, the people working in the shop thought there was someone else with Timothy McVeigh.
But if I'm to believe the narrative being put forth, they're saying that the other person didn't exist. So 24 people made up an individual out of thin air. Am I to understand that that's the FBI story now?
100%. In this case, it's not one suspicious jail cell suicide by hanging, or even two, but this case has three.
All right, we are joined today by Margaret Roberts, the author of a really compelling book, Blowback, the Untold Story of the FBI and the Oklahoma City bombing. And this is a very interesting book. Now we're going into 30 years since the incident, or actually over 30 years now, since the incident took place. And truthfully, in 1995, I was sort of worried about being in the Army, in the field. I didn't really pay much attention. I just knew that there was some, wacko, lone nut terrorist, white supremacist type, blew up a building, got executed a few years later, but it appears there's so much more to the story. How are you doing today, Margaret?
Great to be with you, Eric. So much more to the story. Just a week ago, I was giving a talk at a 9/11 event. And on that day, I was having this powerful flashback to April 19, 1995, which is the date of the Oklahoma City bombing. And that bombing still stands as America's deadliest domestic terror attack. It was a bolt from nowhere in the middle of the country, in the middle of the week, at the beginning of a workday. A 9-story federal office building had the front of it blown off by this deadly explosion, killing 168 innocent men, women, and children, injuring hundreds more, and just creating a spectacle for those of us who watched it almost immediately on live TV unfold as a live national disaster, with the injured, the dead, the families of the injured desperately looking for their loved ones, the first responders clustering around that building and trying to make sense out of something that no one could understand.
You hope and you pray that every time you turn a stone, there'll be a survivor somewhere. It hurts deep down as to why someone would do something of this magnitude.
This story begins as a manhunt, Eric. Last week began the manhunt for the murderer who assassinated Charlie Kirk, and the big rollout of who could have done this and where is he and when will he be captured. All of that is the feeling of the moment that begins my investigation. And we remember the icon of that tragedy as the firefighter cradling the dead or dying baby in his arms, because the tragedy that we took away from that moment was that 15 children in their daycare center on the second floor of that building were just slaughtered in the instant.
Very true. Now, early in the book, and this is where it gets interesting. You open with I guess the hero in the book is Kenneth Trentadue, and his brother Jesse would be the heroes. Um, it starts off though, everything's revolving around a manhunt specifically for John Doe's 1 and 2. And John Doe 1, most would say, is Timothy McVeigh. He was captured, but there's this John Doe 2 that seems to be a specter throughout your book. So a couple questions on that to get rolling. Do you feel that Timothy McVeigh was in fact John Doe 1? He was captured and that was correct.
I say with confidence that Timothy McVeigh delivered the bomb, set off the bomb. No question in my mind, Timothy McVeigh was guilty. Um, when you ask, was he John Doe 1, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but those,
Mhm.
the FBI wanted poster was created from the witnesses to the rental of the bomb truck, which happened up in Kansas. And um, all the witnesses there at the truck rental agency told the FBI that two men were present when the bomb truck was rented. The composite sketch of the man who rented the truck, who went by the name Robert Kling, was believed to have been Timothy McVeigh. But based on my investigation, as we get into this further, I don't believe Timothy McVeigh rented the bomb truck. I do believe
Hmm.
he delivered the bomb. Um, but you're pointing to the great and grand riddle of this case, Eric, in the enigmatic figure of the other man, John Doe 2, who was seen both in during the rental of the truck. He was there with John Doe 1 and also delivering the bomb. So 24 eyewitnesses on the ground in Oklahoma City saw glimpses of two men in the Ryder truck deliver the bomb and exit the bomb truck, which tells you that from square one of this investigation, reality, the witnesses, 24 of them, departs completely from the story you heard in the Army about this one guy who blew up the Mira building, because actually there were two of them. And the second man has never been identified.
Okay, now that's where I think it gets really significant, and there's an underlying case that you're putting together in the book of John Doe number 2. And I do find it very troubling that the FBI was seeking him. There was a drawing for him. Everybody was looking for him. But then at some point, the FBI said, sorry, not true. There was only one guy. He was a lone nut, and that was Timothy McVeigh. Where I'm troubled by this is, as you said, there's 24 witnesses to the other person. Now, I could see 24 witnesses getting the description of the other person wrong. Like maybe they're 5'10" instead of 5'8", or a little shorter, or a little taller, whatever. But if I'm to believe the narrative being put forth, they're saying that the other person didn't exist. So 24 people made up an individual out of thin air. Am I to understand that that's the FBI story now?
100%. And it became it just cascades into discrepancy after discrepancy. The way in which that was walked back, the FBI walked back John Doe 2, happened about 6 weeks after the bombing, when all of a sudden they produced this soldier, 2 soldiers actually, from a nearby army base, and said, oops, the mechanic in the truck rental shop just made a mistake. He must have been talking about these 2 guys who came in on a different day. Somehow time traveled them into his memory, and it must have been them.
If there is one person who knows about the Oklahoma City bombing, it's this man.
I believe there was not a John Doe number 2.
Now Edmond Police Chief Bob Ricks. But at the time of the bombing, Ricks was an FBI agent and one of the lead investigators on the case.
But John Doe number 2 was just a military individual that was in there with a friend renting a Ryder truck.
In Oklahoma, 24 people saw the two of them. Exactly, and described this second man, shorter than John Doe 1, stockier, bodybuilder type, dark hair, described him similarly. So, the story didn't fly, except that it was the official story. It was the FBI talking. And so to this day, that story of the soldier stands. But there's one more piece of this, which is so significant and happens within months after this to additionally brand this story as a deception, which is that one of the grand jurors on the McVeigh grand jury was so troubled by what, and as you know, grand jury proceedings are totally secret.
This would be Hoppy Heidelberg?
Yes.
This is the Jeff Davis show in Dallas, Texas. Going to do a short interview with Hoppy Heidelberg, who was basically, Hoppy, if you'd fill us in, you were kind of a grand juror of the McVeigh trial.
So we were seated in January. We didn't become the dedicated bombing grand jury until May of 95. We delivered our indictments on August the 10th, 95. And then after I realized that there was not going to be an investigation of the bombing, I wrote a letter to the judge telling him what was going on. And he either had to answer my letter or kick me off the jury, and so he did.
Hoppy Heidelberg was sitting on the McVeigh grand jury, was so troubled by what was going on inside that jury that he went rogue. He started passing information to the Daily Oklahoman. He complained to his congressman, and eventually, he gave an interview to the media, which he wasn't supposed to do, and that eventually got him kicked off the jury. But before that, he wrote a long letter to the judge in which he accused the federal prosecutors of rigging the grand jury, specifically by hiding the identity of John Doe 2. So there you have just an incredibly compelling witness to the engineering of that story.
To get into John Doe 2 and how this ties in literally to the jump of the book, once again, can you describe John Doe 2's physical description? Or correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it is a person who's not as tall, like between 5'6" and 5'8", stocky of build, dark hair, and specifically with a dragon tattoo on one arm?
The FBI description describes that he may have had a tattoo. His distinguishing feature was his build. He was very muscular, thick neck, dark hair cut straight across the nape of his neck, and very muscular build. And yes, a tattoo, and may have been driving a brown pickup truck.
Okay, now why this becomes significant is the hero of the story is a Kenneth Trentadue, who was picked up, from what I understand, crossing into California from Mexico for a parole violation. And what is the physical description of Ken Trentadue?
You're exactly right, Eric. Again, in mid-June, at just almost exactly the same moment, the FBI was walking back John Doe 2 for the public, telling the public, oops, all these witnesses were mistaken. At that moment, they were arresting Kenneth Trentadue, who in stature, height, weight, matched the description of John Doe too, as well as having the tattoo. And yes, Kenneth Trentadue's tattoo was a showy dragon tattoo on his bicep. So, and in one more regard, which no one knew about until much later, when his brother Jesse Trentadue discovered it, Kenneth Trentadue matched the profile that the FBI was looking for, though they weren't publicizing it. They had come to believe that John Doe too was a bank robber, and Kenneth Trentadue had served time for bank robbery.
And this is because at the time, concurrently, there was a group called the Aryan Revolutionary Army, or I'm sorry, Aryan Republican Army, who was committing a spate of crimes, whom some people suspect may have helped fund the Oklahoma City attack.
That is the theory, and it takes some 20 years to evolve this theory. But the Aryan Republican Army became front and center in our investigation. And by our, I mean Jesse Trentadue's investigation, which is the one that I join and follow and chronicle in my book, Blowback.
It's painful to see my brother's face again, although that's burned, that image is burned in my brain forever. To see your parents who died during this fight, and you had no time to grieve, you just consumed by the fight. And I didn't start out to distrust and hate the Department of Justice. They earned that distrust and hate. I didn't start out to solve the Oklahoma City bombing. I didn't start out to expose the corruption on a massive level in the Department of Justice.
There's some eerie parallels to modern day, specifically 2019. But let's go into what happened with Kenneth Trentadue. From your book, from what I understand, the Trentadue family received a phone call from the Bureau of Prisons offering them the courtesy of returning the ashes of Kenneth Trentadue, who had been found deceased by his own hand in the cell.
He was arrested in California and sat in custody in California for 2 months until mid-August, when suddenly, out of the blue, he was transferred to Oklahoma City. And it was there 3 days later that his body was found bloody, bruised.
But we didn't know that at the time, correct? Now, from my understanding, he was in a special housing unit. Everybody note that, SHU, special housing unit. They call it a SHU. And they reported to the family, he took himself out, and the family refused to take the ashes and said, hey, you need to ship him home. Is that
That's
correct?
exactly right. The phone call came to Kenneth's mother. The warden named him by not as Kenneth Trentadue, but as Vance Paul Brockway, which was an alias he had used as a bank robber years before. And that was very peculiar. But again, we have this bank robbery connection working here, where the Aryan Republican Army were bank robbers, and none of this is known at the time. What is known is, you're quite right, the prison says, your son, to the mother, your son has committed suicide, and makes the bizarre offer of free cremation. The mother says, no, I'm going to have to talk to his brother, who is a lawyer, about this. And that is how Jesse Trentadue enters the investigation, which has become his life's work ever since. For 30 years, he has been seeking answers. What quickly happens is that when the family insists that the prison ship the body home, they bring it to the funeral home, instruct them to remove the heavy coroner's makeup from Kenneth Trentadue that was applied at the prison, and there they discover these horrific injuries, bruises, stun gun-like injuries on his feet. His throat is slashed. He has been tortured, and this has been made to look like what the prison describes it as a suicide by hanging.
To draw the parallel so people understand what I'm talking about, this prison special housing unit's a very special thing. This is where they put, very serious, hard case people that they're really monitoring, and there should be surveillance coverage. And what did the surveillance footage say about who went in and out of the cell and what happened that day with Kenneth?
Well, this becomes a huge issue of contention between Jesse Trentadue and the prison. But let's add two more points about this special housing unit. He was housed in a proof, state-of-the-art cell. It was a new facility, and he was in solitary confinement. And one of the questions that Jessie shrewdly asked the warden, and so she was on the record saying that he had been examined before being put in that cell, and he had no injuries. So it was just impossible to explain his condition when they discovered him dead at 3 a.m. Only something like 22 minutes after the last watch had seen him alive. To your question, Eric, about the videotape, and here we have this hanging, and our audience may be beginning to think to themselves, this is almost sounding like the Jeffrey Epstein case, because this the cameras were said to have malfunctioned. They did have guards who were summoned to the cell, and one of them took videotape, which was quickly described as a malfunction. Camera didn't work. There were also some Polaroids, still photographs that were taken. Half of those quickly disappeared. All of this is happening within hours or days of Kenneth's death. So it became very difficult to chronicle exactly what had happened. Logbooks disappeared. Transcripts were edited, and a few years later, looking back at this in a letter to a journalist, Timothy McVeigh himself was caustic on the subject of, how does this always happen? How do these cameras always malfunction? And went on to say that, should anything ever happen to me in my cell here, I'm sure that the cameras would also malfunction.
Oddly enough, let's look at the parallels. Bureau of Prisons run the operation. Both cases, check. Special housing unit. Both cases, check. On a self-deletion watch. Both cases, check. Solitary confinement. Both cases, check. Cameras are broken. Check. Well, in Epstein's case, one camera was working out of 5. There were 5 cameras in the unit. One was working. Coincidentally, the only one that had a specific angle that people could walk by and traverse the stairs, etc., without actually being caught on camera. So it's very odd that is the working camera in the unit. I encourage everyone to comment below where we are wrong in being troubled by the technological failures with the Bureau of Prisons. I will just put it that way, because this is very odd. Now,
Well,
Kenneth, though, is not the only one who died.
in this case, it's not one suspicious jail cell suicide by hanging or even two, but this case has three prisoners connected to the case who all die in the same way, supposedly suicide by hanging. The second one is, and we've mentioned the Aryan Republican Army before, the co-leader of the Aryan Republican Army. And as our story, it is a little bit of a complex story. So let's just stop and double click on Kenneth Trentadue as the mystery inside the mystery of the Oklahoma City bombing. Because what's going to happen as our investigation goes forward, and in a way that Jesse Trentadue never imagined or intended, he was out to solve his brother's murder, but it is about to become connected to the Oklahoma City bombing. The second death, the second supposed suicide by hanging, is Richard Lee Guthrie, who was the co-leader of the Aryan Republican Army gang.
The Aryan Republican Army, or ARA.
These were very professional bank robbers, along the lines of Jesse James or John Dillinger. They robbed 22 banks, stole about $250,000, never got caught during a bank robbery.
We basically have three general objectives: eliminate the government, exterminate, and repatriate all non-whites with their lands.
They hit 22 banks around the Midwest in the 1990s, overlapping with the Oklahoma City bombing. And he and his co-leader were captured in early 1996. The FBI quietly suspected a connection between McVeigh and the ARA, but they never pursued that aggressively publicly. But Richard Lee, once they captured Richard Lee Guthrie and pressed him, he rolled over on the rest of the gang and agreed to tell federal prosecutors about their plan to overthrow the federal government. And it was in that period of time, after he had made his deal to testify against the others, that he was sudden, and also told a Los Angeles Times reporter that he was writing a tell-all and was going to blow the lid off the Oklahoma City bombing. It was at that moment that Richard Lee Guthrie, under watch of the U.S. Marshal Service, was found hanging in his jail cell.
How are the cameras there?
That's a very good question, Eric. I don't know the answer to it. I've never heard any references to there being cameras on Richard Lee Guthrie. He was not in a federal facility. He was in a local jail, or a jail where he was awaiting this hearing where he was going to testify against one of these bank robbers. He was in a Kentucky jail.
Okay, well then there may not have been cameras.
There might not have been.
Okay.
The third of these mystery hangings came a few years later. Jesse Trentadue, the lawyer, still pursuing his brother's death, confronting this Stonewall at the prison, confronting the lack of pictures, just compressing the story, the lack of pictures and videotape made it very hard to make a criminal case in front of the federal grand jury. And they eventually did not bring any charges against anyone in his death. It was Jesse who filed a wrongful deaths lawsuit against the federal government. And his star witness who came forward in the late 90s to say that he had been on that cell block that night and he had seen and heard parts of Kenneth's murder. That witness, Alden Gillis Baker, who had been moved to a prison in California by the time he gave his deposition in the case, months before he was to testify, and after begging the prosecutor in the wrongful death, or not in the wrongful death case, after begging a federal prosecutor to give him protection because he was under threat, he was found dead in his federal prison cell. And I'm not even sure there was ever even an autopsy on Gillis Baker. And I don't know whether there
That's
were...
federal. Camera question again.
Yeah, camera question. I never have heard any reference to cameras on that scene, but it's a darn good question.
Anyway, I would definitely like to find out as much of that, but I do want to address something to the audience now, because okay, we're going down conspiracy row here. This is looking really bad, and if we are being realistic and cynical, we'll be like, okay, well, how real is this? There is an outcome that lends a lot of credence to this. Jesse Trentadue did not leave the case empty-handed. If I recall, he won a sizable amount of money from, I believe, it was the Bureau of Prisons. Can you set the record straight on what he actually did or did not win?
Yes, well, that is the wrongful death lawsuit where Alden Gillis Baker was to be the star witness, but Jesse had amassed a mountain of evidence, including the testimony of the prison guard who shot the video and had testified multiple places that he saw Kenneth Trentadue hanging in his cell. Well, through Jesse's investigation, a years-long investigation, and a collaboration with a fine investigative reporter for GQ magazine, that investigation had revealed that the prison guard had lied under oath, and this became part of the record in the wrongful death case. So there was a mountain of forensic evidence showing that, staff had lied, that Jesse had found other witnesses, notably the orderly who was tasked with cleaning up Kenneth's cell. And let's remember, hanging deaths are relatively bloodless, and this orderly described this cell as a bloodbath. He had to use a mop to clean it up. And so there was very compelling evidence at the trial. However, not to the point of allowing or opening the door to the judge agreeing that this was a murder. The final judgment in this case was essentially, cruel misuse of the body, cruelty inflicted on the family of Kenneth Trentadue regarding the handling of the death, but leaving the suicide finding on the record, which is to Jesse's unending fury. I mean, that was the final stain on this, that he had spent 5 years bringing this lawsuit and still went away. He did win for the family over $1 million. The judge knew very well that this was wrong what had happened here, but wasn't able to say it was a murder.
Do you feel, and I don't know if you could speak for Jesse or not, that was an attempt of a payoff? Like, here, you've got some money, shut up and go away.
I do. I think the judge was attempting to send the signal, we know what happened here, but the evidence and the crime scene were so compromised that there's no way to prove it. And the dollar figure, sent the message, this was a crime.
And I wanted to point that out because, it's very easy to go, here we go again. Here we go again. We're talking about this, talking about that. There are some very extremely troubling circumstances around his death. It raises a lot of questions, and they don't just hand out $1 million+ verdicts for nothing, especially when you're going against the government. They do not pay. The government collects money from us. They don't pay money to us. It's not a normal thing.
Absolutely.
So I want to just kind of ask some overall questions of you. And just so everybody knows, I'm short shrifting the book really badly right now because there's so many details, such a labyrinthian, I guess, weave in this book. And hopefully these questions will help encourage you to check it out. Flat out, do you think the FBI covered up the real story of the Oklahoma City bomb?
Yes.
And who do you think, and I'm not making you go on the record for anything certain, but do you think was John Doe 2, and why did he actually vanish from the record?
Based on the interviews, and I'm the only, I was able through Jesse, because Jesse designated me as his paralegal. So I was able to go inside maximum security prisons and talk to prisoners that the media can't talk to. One of them, and we may not get to, but one of them is Terry Nichols, who is, and I'm the only journalist to ever interview Terry Nichols in Supermax, Timothy McVeigh's convicted co-conspirator. Also, I interviewed David Paul Hammer, who was McVeigh's cell block mate on death row, who interviewed him for 23 months before his execution and wrote a book, actually wrote 2 books. I edited the second one, which is a kind of a sequel, about those death row interviews with Timothy McVeigh. I bring them up here because McVeigh told Hammer that his hit squad, his team, support team on the ground in Oklahoma City on April 19 was the Aryan Republican Army. Again, that would be Richard Guthrie and Peter Langan, who is another of these prisoners I interviewed for Jesse. But McVeigh said the Aryan Republican Army was his squad. Richard Lee Guthrie is a candidate for John Doe 2. David Hammer told me 2 different stories, so I'm not prepared to say which one of these guys, Aryan Republican Army members, was John Doe 2, but I believe it to have been one of them.
Significant question on that. In your book, you also talk about a leg being found, and you think that leg belonged to John Doe number 2. And was there an individual in the Aryan Republican Army or somewhere who stopped reporting to work or stopped showing up? Is there a possibility of someone that it could be who disappeared?
Yeah, great question. And since we're on death row talking to David Hammer about what McVeigh told him, McVeigh described a detailed scenario in which a man he called Poindexter, pretty clearly a code name, was brought in by his handler. Let's share the bombshell and uncorroborated revelation from the death row interviews in which Timothy McVeigh told David Hammer that he had operated in the Oklahoma City bombing not as a terrorist, but as an undercover federal operative. And he told Hammer that he reported to an undesignated unit in the Pentagon, the Defense Department.
McVeigh said that he was the undercover?
Yes, he told Hammer this, and he told Terry Nichols a similar story, which Nichols shared with Jesse and me in our interview in Supermax. Terry Nichols told us that as the bomb plot neared its end, and McVeigh was under tremendous pressure and doing methamphetamine, that he let slip to Nichols that he was an undercover operative. And he told Nichols he was reporting to the FBI. So there are these stories out there. They're matching stories. They're both told by criminals. But there is some
question to clarify, undercover operative or an informant, aka snitch? Because there's a difference. Like Whitey Bulger was in fact an FBI informant. It has been proven conclusively. Was he an informant like Bulger, or was he actually saying that he was on the payroll as an agent?
Not an agent, an asset or an informant. Let's call him an informant.
Okay.
Yeah. And for those, and it's a fascinating, it is uncorroborated, and yet I will mention two stunning independent facts here that we need to think about. One is that there is a letter in the record that McVeigh wrote his sister Jennifer at some point, in which he told her that he had been pulled out of this his tryout for special forces and put in this unit that was designated to do domestic and foreign undercover work. And
when was that letter dated?
It was the New York Times published that letter in the late 1990s, I believe. So I'm gonna say early 90s for the date on it. I don't remember.
But was it written before Oklahoma City bombing?
Yes, before the bombing. Yes, definitely. The other piece of research, tremendous research by Wendy Painting, who wrote a book about McVeigh, about the bombing. She went to Texas, to the archives, and found a record. Timothy McVeigh was assigned a public defender, and they immediately tried to get out of that case as fast as they could. And they did, but they had McVeigh as their client through his preliminary hearing. And in early interviews with them, he told them that he had been acting as an undercover operative. So those was the first interviews he gave to anyone. And he told them another amazing fact, which matches with how Terry Nichols described the bombing for Jesse and me, which is that he said he was stunned when the bomb went off and he saw the degree of damage done, suggesting that McVeigh, if this is true, if this scenario is true, did not believe that his bomb could have done what that bomb did to the Murrah building. And I'm sorry, I brought us afield from your question about who was John Doe 2, but
well, he's Poindexter, possibly, from what you were saying, correct?
The Poindexter, thank you. that's the thread we need to tie off. McVeigh told Hammer that Poindexter was the actual bomb maker. He was the guy that made the bomb big enough to do the damage it did. And McVeigh described that bomb building effort happening late into the night before the actual blast. So he said he drove the materials from Kansas to Oklahoma City, and Poindexter, and assisted by McVeigh and the ARA, or some in the ARA, built the bomb. And then, according to McVeigh, the major, that was the code name that McVeigh gave his handler. According to McVeigh, the major summoned one of his helpers as they were admiring their work, this huge bomb, and they slit Poindexter's throat and threw him in the back of the truck. So if you accept the story, and it's quite debatable, that Timothy McVeigh told, that the bomb maker himself may well have been the leg. The leg may have belonged to the bomb maker.
Okay, now there's going to be a few things, and I'll try to stay on track here, but that brings us into another biochemist, Stephen Coburn. So Stephen Coburn, who I believe drove a brown pickup truck, was kind of sketchy, actually went to prison for a while, tied to this somehow. Well, he maybe was suspected of being a bomb maker, but he's not a bomb maker. But if Poindexter's dead, then it can't be Coburn if Poindexter did it. So how does Stephen Coburn, the guy who grew up in Oxnard, attended UCLA, and was a biochemist, does he play into this, or is that just a
Stephen
distraction?
Coburn, in my opinion, is an abiding mystery and continuing person of interest in this case, because what happens is, and again, I mean, I'm privy to the stories that McVeigh told other prisoners, and Coburn, by the way, figures prominently in the story McVeigh told Hammer. He told Hammer that he hung out in Arizona for the months, the run up to the bombing, with Stephen Coburn, and left Arizona with everything he needed to know about how to make his bomb. Coburn was one of, when the FBI was in the trenches looking for John Doe 2 before they canceled the manhunt, Stephen Coburn was the headline. In the news coverage of the time, it absolutely appeared that they had their man when Stephen Coburn was arrested in Arizona. And in fact, a page one story with an unnamed federal source had reported, this was in May, so a few weeks after the bombing, had reported that that the cameras on the trooper's car who arrested McVeigh, if everyone remembers, about 90 minutes after the bombing, this highway patrol trooper arrested McVeigh for driving without a license. And then he discovered that he had a concealed weapon. The newspaper article, based on the unnamed federal source, reported that the trooper's camera captured a brown pickup truck, and that was ongoing. There was an all points bulletin for a while that day for a brown pickup truck, captured the brown pickup truck pulling over when McVeigh was arrested. And according to the reporters, and they were top journalists, this was page one, the trooper's dash cam captured Stephen Coburn's license plate on the brown pickup truck. And so he was then and there, uh, a, a prime person of interest as a potential John Doe too.
And what does Stephen Coburn look like? Could you
He
describe him?
he's dark. He has dark hair. A lot of these guys look fairly similar. Um, I wouldn't describe him as that bodybuilder type that is such a distinctive trait of some of the John Doe 2 characteristics. But he certainly had the chemistry background, and at the time he was arrested, it it appeared that that the FBI had found John Doe too, but very quickly, um, his the whole thing unwrapped, and there were more apparently
Could he have
incriminating.
been John Doe 1? I'm just asking because you were
John
saying
Doe
that
1 was a
you're not
blonde. John Doe 1
okay.
John Doe 1 looked very much like Timothy McVeigh.
Okay.
So, um, probably not.
Okay.
But by the time Stephen Coburn was wanted on weapons charges, and by the time they got him into court in Arizona, Janet Napolitano, the U.S. attorney there, made a heavyweight appearance before the judge, and they just basically collected Stephen Coburn. Whatever he may have had to say about, any relation to Timothy McVeigh, and it turned out he picked up mail for Timothy McVeigh in Kingman, Arizona. So they definitely knew each other, but and there were reports that explosives were found, traces of explosives were found. He did have a brown truck, but that was supposedly filled with cobwebs, and everybody just waved it off. Nothing to see here, and everything that had led people to cue in on Stephen Coburn just quickly evaporated.
Now, interestingly, whatever happened with Stephen Coburn? What is he doing now?
Stephen Coburn did some time for the weapons charges because he was a fugitive at the time he was arrested. He had been hiding out in Arizona working as a short order crook. His alibi for April 19 was full of holes, having told some people that he was going to visit his family in LA, but then when the family was interviewed, they hadn't seen him since the previous September, and then his friend or roommate in Arizona said, no, he was sitting right here with me watching TV that day. So it was, a very sketchy alibi for April 19, 1995 from Stephen Coburn. He did his time, not a lot of time, I think, a few years, and came out as a UFO expert. And so joined that, group of people who are speculating about aliens, alien abduction, and UFOs. And he's, I don't know what he does to earn a living these days, but that's the last that I know of Stephen Coburn.
Okay, I want to jump to the side because you've actually spoken to Terry Nichols, and I've always kind of wondered, like, who the hell is Terry Nichols? How is he related to this? I know that he's, they try to get him on death row. I know he's in Supermax, but what exactly, who is he and what was his real role in the conspiracy?
Terry Nichols is a man of mysteries. I wish I could tell you, having met him and sat with him for several hours, what makes him tick. What I can tell you is he struck me as he was meeting him in Supermax. He was such a diminutive figure, so much smaller than I imagined. And so he seemed visibly tortured. I mean, he seemed to be a man in agony. There came a moment, he's quiet, he's he doesn't have much affect when he speaks, except occasionally a kind of like aw shucks, joshing humor. There came a moment late in the interview, however, when I asked him, he was wearing, I believe, I'm checking my own memory now, but I asked him about his marriage, and he just began to cry. Just tears just like streamed down his face. Not crying, but tears. And I felt, I felt the desolation of this man, because he was so worried about his children. I mean, he knew what he had done. I accept his representation of his relationship with McVeigh being the weaker member of that conspiracy. He was a helper. What McVeigh told Nichols to do, he did. And what leverage McVeigh had over Nichols, I don't have a theory about that. But the part of it, so pretty quickly, what happened to Nichols is he was in over his head. They were supposed to be partners in an Army surplus business. And yet, pretty soon, McVeigh manages to enlist Nichols to steal materials, blasting caps, etc., from this quarry in Kansas. And now Nichols has committed a serious felony. And so from then on, McVeigh could hold this over his head. And then pretty soon, he convinces, and Nichols was trying to backpedal out of this relationship. And McVeigh asked him to do one more thing, which was commit this robbery of the gun dealer, Roger Moore. And Nichols agreed. And that was really the end of it. Once, he had committed that robbery, he was so deep into this, and just one thing led to another. So deep in, by the time McVeigh ordered him to help build the bomb, he again had to agree. So I accept that aspect. What troubles me, Eric, is the blank space of all of Terry Nichols' travels to the Philippines. I mean, he was in the Philippines in late 1994 when Ramzi Youssef, the 1993 World Trade Center bomber, was there plotting a terror attack. And there was a witness, a terrorist turned informant, who told authorities that Terry Nichols attended a meeting with Ramzi Youssef in the Philippines.
That's a little less domestic now.
Yes, absolutely. So those are unanswered questions. A Congressman Rohrabacher back, afterward, tried to go in, investigate this, interviewed Terry Nichols once, but Nichols bailed out of the second interview, telling Rohrbacher, if you just want to pursue the Philippines, there's nothing there. So I'm not convinced. I think, and knowing Terry Nichols' personality, I think it's entirely possible that somebody had the same kind of influence over him there that McVeigh had.
Or could he be playing you?
Absolutely. Jesse and I were under the impression going there that we were going to learn from Terry Nichols how McVeigh was connected to the ARA, the Aryan Republican Army gang. But Terry Nichols had his own agenda. He, and it wasn't even mainly to tell us about this revelation, supposed revelation that McVeigh was the undercover operative. What Nichols wanted to do was bury the gun dealer, Roger Moore. Nichols was still seething over the fact that Roger Moore, the gun dealer that he admittedly robbed on orders from McVeigh, but Terry Nichols said Roger Moore was in the thick of this plot, that Roger Moore was the government's agent provocateur in the bomb plot, and that he had actually provided explosives to Timothy McVeigh that McVeigh used in the bomb. So if you think about that, if that would be true, then the government, itself was involved here in the actual building of that bomb.
Well, I guess, and I don't know this nearly as deep as you do and all that. I have different thoughts or things that strike me. And I kind of wonder, what if Timothy McVeigh was the soldier and Terry Nichols was the boss? Would everything line up with your interview and everything else going on if we flipped it? If we said, just hypothetically, that Terry Nichols is actually in charge and he sent his soldier out to deliver that device. He was in charge of the gun dealer and he ran the robbery and the gun dealer or whatever else. I'm just asking, does that work?
I never thought of that. As Terry Nichols said said in Supermax, who benefited from all of this? It wasn't McVeigh and it wasn't Nichols. McVeigh is dead and Nichols is doing life in Supermax. So his theory was that it was someone else who was behind McVeigh, and that person was free and clear of consequences from the bombing. I guess I
And
go
he gave
back.
you a name, right? He gave you that name, right? I mean,
did.
because those skin off his nose, who's the one that was behind it all that's free? Who was the one that Timothy McVeigh went and got a lethal injection to protect? Who was this individual?
Terry Nichols did name Larry Potts, who was a disgraced, demoted former FBI director who played pivotal roles in both Ruby Ridge and Waco, which are the standard way we look at Timothy McVeigh as carrying a grudge about federal government overreach in
But
those
you have
two
one more
cases.
after that too. There's one more, and that is Snell, right?
Yes,
Executed on the same day. So,
absolutely.
Like I hate to jump that in. That's almost burying the lead, though. So you have Waco happened that day, but also the Snell happened that day. So there's
Yes,
questions of all of that.
yes.
So I'm sorry. Please continue.
Well, to your question, could it, Larry Potts. So a lot of people look at that revelation, the Potts revelation, and say, and again, it was Nichols said that McVeigh let this name slip once only in frustration, because he said Larry Potts had changed the target of the bombing, and never mentioned Larry Potts's name again. So here again, we have to draw our own conclusion. Do we believe this, or do we entertain the possibility that Larry Potts is kind of a placeholder name that Nichols gave us, and that it was really someone else in the FBI, or is Terry Nichols blowing smoke here? Leaving Supermax that day, this was one of the things that I just was obsessed with. Like, why would he name Larry Potts? And I found it hard to believe, because you have to remember, Terry Nichols had been trying to get someone to listen to his story ever since 2004. Jesse, that was 2 years before Jesse and I made our visit to him. He wrote a letter to Attorney General Ashcroft. It's the first thing he did after the threat of the death penalty was off his shoulders, after his second trial, the state trial in Oklahoma. And there he said, "Come see me. I want to tell the victims what really happened here." I mean, he claimed to have a story to tell, but he was demanding that Ashcroft allow him to accuse the federal government, because through Roger Moore. He never could get over the fact that Roger Moore was treated as a victim in all these bombing trials, while Terry Nichols, was crushed by, the consequences of what he had done. And in Supermax, he turned over what I call the Nichols dossier. This is hundreds of pages. To your question earlier about the Nichols personality, he's very detail oriented. He doesn't forget a wrong, and he sought to bury Roger Moore with evidence, and much of his evidence is extremely compelling.
Doesn't sound completely meek to me. So, just thought, okay, well, I like to wrap up, and just again to everybody, I'm barely scratching the surface. There's so much here, and with the limited time, we can't go into all the crazy details and rabbit holes in every direction that is here. But with that in mind, I always like to ask, what is the one question that I should have asked you, but I neglected to?
Well, your questions are great. I'm all about that camera footage on Alden Baker. I think if there is an area we didn't get to, it's not that the question wasn't asked, but very significant here is, and it again relates to John Doe too. It's the surveillance video footage. Again, let's circle back to the beginning of this investigation and our talk, which is, not only did 24 witnesses see John Doe 2, but quickly top journalists began reporting that the FBI had surveillance videotape of the delivery of the bomb. From a
YMCA, correct?
Well, they didn't specifically. It might have been in the YMCA, but there were numerous potential sources for this. The Y was one of them. The apartment building down the street, the tall apartment building, is another one. And the Mura building itself, with its cameras, that's disputed. But the reporters, somebody had surveillance video of the delivery of the bomb Timothy McVeigh and John Doe too on camera, getting out of the truck, and the bomb going off. Now imagine this. Why is it that the American public has never seen this movie? I mean, this was the crime of the century. It was not shown at McVeigh's trial. It becomes significant and tied to the John Doe 2 mystery. I should perhaps touch on this, and I hope it's just more inviting those who want to know this whole incredible story. Jesse's theory is that, and it started with a tip, a lead from Timothy McVeigh himself, that the FBI killed Kenneth Trentadue in an interrogation because it believed that he was John Doe too. Timothy McVeigh sent Jesse Trentadue a message from death row and said, "The FBI mistook your brother for Richard Lee Guthrie." So there, to answer an earlier question, Eric, was McVeigh essentially telegraphing, whether you believe him or not, that Richard Lee Guthrie was John Doe too. To return to
who also passed away later on. Guthrie himself did perish ultimately.
In the jail cell hanging, right? In the mysterious jail cell hanging. These videotapes become so significant later when Jesse Trentadue files a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit, and the FBI fights tooth and nail, and still has to.
I was wondering about this. 30 years and no FOIAs have been able to be accomplished?
Jesse's been all about FOIA lawsuits, and some of the best and strongest evidence in my book, Blowback, comes out of an early FOIA lawsuit. Memos from an FBI director. I'll just leave it there because I want to be able to wrap up this picture story, which is toward the end of our investigation, a deep throat steps out of the shadows. He is John Matthews, a top FBI spy in the 1990s in an undercover program called PATCON, targeting right-wing extremists. And he just unloads on the scope of PATCON as a rogue surveillance program, and drops the fact that, and he actually reports to Jesse that he, while working as a PATCON spy, had Timothy McVeigh under surveillance months before the bombing, and also followed members of the Aryan Republican Army out in Arizona. So the FBI fighting the surveillance videotapes, which, as you point out, this is years and decades later. All these bombing prosecutions are complete. There's no ground for hiding this videotape any longer, unless the people who are in the shot that we see, the bomb truck delivered, the two figures, unless one of them or someone else in the shot may have been an undercover operative, or after interviewing John Matthews, as Jesse came to entertain the possibility that it might even have been PATCON itself that was surveilling the delivery of the bomb that day. We don't know any of that. We just know that no one outside the FBI was ever allowed to see those videotapes, which now the FBI has switched horses in its representations in court and says those videotapes never existed.
Oh, like the John Doe number 2. They're hanging out in a garage somewhere.
There you have it.
Okay. Well, Margaret, thank you so much. And everybody, the book again is Blowback. There's a link in the description. Definitely check it out. I want to try to look into this even more, but this is really whetted my appetite. And thank you so much again, Margaret.
My pleasure. Thank you, Eric.